Hey, what's up guys, I'm Jacob Kaufman, I'm on the street, and today I'm just going to be talking a little bit about Linux, and there's no software available for it. So, if you have ever tried Linux or ever considered trying Linux, one of the things that probably held you back a little bit was a program that you use on Windows that is not available for Linux. For me, that would be Fraps. Every program on Windows that I use, there's a Linux alternative or a version of, except for Fraps, which is the only reason that I still have a Windows installation, is for video game recording for my entertainment channel. For my parents, that program was AOL. Pretty much everything they do on the computer, they could do on Linux, except AOL, which was not available for Linux, only Windows and Mac. So yeah, that's why they can switch to Linux. I know somebody who wanted to switch to Linux, except Photoshop wasn't available for Linux. And, well, why can't you just use GIMP? They actually said that GIMP worked perfectly fine, except they had a Wacom tablet, that the drivers were not available for Linux, and they could still use the tablet, but pressure sensitivity did not work. So they had to stick with Windows for pressure sensitivity of the tablet, because the drivers weren't available for Linux. And all of these different things, it's really annoying that, you know, Linux doesn't support so many mainstream programs. You know, the Adobe Creative Suite, Linux doesn't support a whole lot of gaming, although Steam... The one downside to using my phone as a camera. So, like I said, that is so annoying. You know, Linux does not support, doesn't support Photoshop, it doesn't support, like, any professional video editors, so you don't have, Premiere, you don't have, Avid, you don't have Sony Vegas, and I mean, so much hardware doesn't work with Linux. I mean, so many, you know, tablets and stuff, there aren't real drivers for Linux, and Linux doesn't provide drivers for every video card that you see, and, you know, that is probably the #1 reason why people don't use Linux. I mean, Silverlight's not available for Linux. I mean, come on, Linux doesn't support Silverlight. Now, hang on. Stop right there. This is the kind of talk I was hearing the other day, watching a live stream. And I completely respect the guys on the live stream. They, after I mentioned what I'm about to tell you, they went back and said, yeah, that was what we meant. But a lot of times, people say, okay, so do you want to switch to Linux because it's faster, it doesn't have viruses, it, you know, this and that and everything. And they say, oh no, Linux doesn't support so-and-so program. Or Linux doesn't support this piece of hardware, so I can't switch to Linux. And, you know, I say, okay, that's fine, I'll put Windows on your computer instead. When you think about it, Linux, because it's open source, a lot of people write things for Linux. A lot of individuals contribute. If there's a specific piece of hardware that Linux doesn't support out of the box, it's very likely that an individual with that piece of hardware might have written their own driver, and you can go online, download that, and that would be an open source driver. People are pretty fortunate to have that the majority of the time. When you're using Linux, yeah, it's really, really great how many people are out there writing things to make Linux support stuff. But Linux supporting stuff is not valid. Is not valid at all. Why are you saying Linux doesn't support my program? Your program does not support Linux. Now, don't get me wrong. I understand that if a certain program or a certain piece of hardware does not support Linux, it's still a completely valid reason not to use Linux. I'm not saying that you should ditch your hardware, your software, and go to Linux. I'm not saying that you can't do that, but if you're complaining and you're saying, oh, I'll switch to Linux when it starts supporting Photoshop, don't say, I will switch when Linux starts supporting Photoshop. Say, I will switch when Photoshop starts supporting Linux. And furthermore, don't complain to the people making Linux, because Linux is a community-driven thing. It is people working for free, putting in time and effort, either because it's their hobby, they enjoy it, or just for whatever reason. It is people working for free to create an absolutely amazing operating system. It is not their responsibility to support every program, every piece of hardware out there. It is the responsibility of the hardware or software manufacturer to support Linux. Hang on. Let's take a look at, if you've never seen, I'm not sure, you probably cannot see it right now. On top of my desk here, I've got a whole array of boxes. And, I'm just gonna pick one out. Alright, sweet. I've got here my Logitech rechargeable touchpad box. And you'll see here, Logitech T650, well, that's dusty, wireless rechargeable touchpad. And you'll see on the side, compatible with Windows 8, compatible with Windows 7. Not compatible with Mac OS. They've got a separate thing that's compatible with Mac, but not Windows. They're the same thing. One uses Bluetooth, the other uses USB. I mean, come on. Anyway, you'll see here, it says compatible with Windows. It does not say compatible with Mac OS. And so, if someone gets a Mac and gets this, and they say, oh, this doesn't work with Mac. Yeah, that's because it doesn't say compatible with Mac on it. Why would it work? Why is it not the same way with Linux? This touchpad works with Linux. It works with Linux better than it works with Mac. It does not have a compatible with Linux logo on it. I just realized those aren't actually stickers, they're just kind of printed on the box, but it does not say compatible with Linux. It says compatible with Windows, yet it works with Linux. And a lot of people get used to that. It's compatible with Linux because there are free open source drivers available that support this. And do they support every function? No. But they support a good deal. You can use it as a mouse. You can use it, 2-finger click for right click, 3-finger click for middle click, scrolling. You can use this with Linux because somebody who had this saw that it was not compatible with Linux. They're like, okay, I want to use this with Linux. I'm going to write a driver. Then I'm going to be a nice person, put it online for other people to use. You can't rely on that. Companies need to stop relying on that. Logitech, there's not going to be a nice person for every one of your products to go and write a driver for you. An example of when you can't rely on that is Fraps. Beepa is the company who makes Fraps. I know these names are weird. I didn't make them. Anyway, Fraps is not available for Mac or Linux, just Windows. And there is not a port. It is closed source, so there's no port for Linux. You'd think, someone's got to have made an alternative for Linux. No. No one has. They did. There is one available called GLC that I have tried, but it was last updated in 2006. It's a miracle you can even install it and have it work, let alone get it to work nicely. But you can't rely on people putting in free work. If you're a company, you have to understand, part of the reason people think companies don't support Linux is the market share is not great enough. Why would we spend money developing for Linux if 90% of our customers are going to be on Windows or Mac? Well, let me turn that around. If companies, like I said, the number one reason I have seen personally for people not switching to Linux is their stuff isn't supported. Their hardware and software are not supported on Linux. If companies were to, invest in a little Linux programming, if Beepa right now were to write a version of Fraps for Linux, guess who would have the leading program, the leading slice of the market share in Linux for game recording? Beepo would absolutely have a monopoly in the Linux game recording sector, because they would be the first and only company to write a program to do that for Linux. If more companies wrote software for Linux, more people would switch. You know, if Adobe were to start making Creative Suite available for Linux as well, how many professionals, how many creative professionals would then have the freedom to switch to Linux? People would say, oh, like gamers. Gamers recently have said Steam is now available for Linux. So, now that Steam's available for Linux, I'm going to switch to Linux. It's going to be the same way with other programs. If Adobe were to waste the money and write software for Linux, write, you know, Photoshop, Illustrator, I don't know, InDesign, whatever else, if Adobe were to write the Creative Suite for Linux, let's say CS7, Adobe Creative Suite 7, version 7 comes out, and it is Windows, Mac, and for the first time ever, first company ever, Linux. Creative software for Linux. Adobe, first of all, so many people would say, okay, the software that I use for my day-to-day work is now available for Linux. I'm a video editor. Premiere is now available on Linux. I'm going to switch to Linux. I'm a photo editor. Photoshop is now available on Linux. I'm going to switch to Linux. I'm a graphic designer. Illustrator is now available for Linux. I'm going to switch then. First of all, so, you know, if companies start writing software for Linux, they've got to do that before customers switch over. Secondly, if Adobe were to do that, then guess who would have the monopoly in creative software for Linux? Adobe. They would have no competitors, and it wouldn't even matter if it's closed source. People say, oh, they don't want to write for Linux because then they'd have to release their source. No, they don't. Just because most software available for Linux is open source does not mean you can't write closed software for it. If you don't want to release the source code for a Linux program, you don't have to. Yes, a lot of people might yell at you, but as more and more people start seeing, hey, this software works a whole lot better than the open source version, then maybe they'll start to care less and less. Firefox and Chrome are both semi-open source, so maybe they're not the best examples, but both of them have support for Linux. Before Firefox and Chrome were on Linux, the only Linux web browsers were like Conqueror, the word I can't say for GNOME. They were really shifty, crappy web browsers. And I'm sorry if I offended anyone who worked on one of those. I'm just saying they're not as good as the mainstream browsers. And I've seen it with my own eyes. They don't render web pages properly a lot of the time. So if Google and Mozilla had said, okay, not a lot of people are using Linux, so we're not going to write software for Linux, then the internet is what we use on our computers most. How many people would have said, okay, Chrome or Firefox is not available for Linux, so I can't switch to Linux? So many people. Linux is just now starting to gain market share, and it's being accompanied by Google is releasing Chrome for Linux. Firefox is always, I don't know if it's always been on Linux, but it's been on Linux for a long time. Steam is just now being written for Linux, and yeah, people are switching to Linux. VMware is available for Linux, which is the proprietary version of VirtualBox. It's not a coincidence. If you write your software for Linux, then your users will be able to switch to Linux. It doesn't make sense. We're going to wait for more people to start using Linux. We're going to wait for more of our customers to switch to Linux before we start writing software for Linux. Wait for your customers to switch to Linux. They're your customers. They are not going to switch to Linux until you start supporting it. You need to support Linux. Linux does not need to support you. Companies need to support Linux. Then, after companies start supporting Linux, then their user bases will start switching. And you might say, still, what's wrong with the current system? 2 major operating systems, 1 major operating system. So maybe companies need a little something extra to push them in that direction. You know, yes, sure, if Adobe started writing Photoshop, or let me think of a new example. If Adobe started writing Photoshop for Linux, then their user base would start switching over. But why do they want their user base to switch over? Why do they need that? If they just keep supporting Windows and Mac, their Windows and Mac customers will continue to be happy, and, you know, people might not switch to Linux, but they'll still be using Adobe stuff. So why would Adobe want to port their stuff to Linux? Like I said, if you are the first company to make something work and make it work good, make it work easily, bug-free, and make it look pretty, you're the first company to do that on Linux, then guess what company Linux users are going to go to? Number one. You are going to be the biggest, you're going to have the biggest market share in Linux. You have companies all over have the opportunity in front of them. You know, I emailed Fraps support and I said, why don't you support Linux? And they're like, they didn't give me an answer. They just said, we don't have plans to support Linux. Why not? If companies were to start writing software for Linux right now, then the first company to get there would have the monopoly. The first company to get there would be the most popular. That would be, I can't even express, like, I hope you get the gist of what I'm saying. I hope you get a sense of what I'm trying to communicate. You know, I think that companies such as Canonical, who are non-profit, are doing a lot to help Linux. But, you know, companies such as Valve, who makes Steam, are doing even more to help people switch over to Linux easily. I mean, if you are an Adobe user, let's say that you use Photoshop, you've tried GIMP, it just doesn't work for you, that is fine. I understand there are differences between Photoshop and GIMP. I understand that there is a difference in support. I understand. So if you're a Photoshop user, and you would like to switch to Linux, but Photoshop is not available for Linux, don't sit there and, well, you should be able to sit there and wait for Adobe to say, alright, let's write this for Linux. But they're not getting the idea. So if you use Photoshop, and you want to switch to Linux, email Adobe, or even better, write physical letters, because those can have a little bit more impact sometimes. So write a letter to Adobe, be it an email or a physical letter or calling them or whatever. Contact Adobe, say, hey, I want this available for Linux. Does one person saying that make a difference? No. Does 10 people, does 100 people saying that make a difference? No. But if over time enough people say it, if Adobe begins to think, maybe we should try supporting Linux, a lot of people have been telling us they want it, then it might happen. Adobe, if they receive enough contacts saying, I want this available for Linux, they are going to need to write it for Linux, because they're going to see the profit opportunity. If enough people write, let's say you use Fraps. If you want to switch to Linux, write BIPA. Say, I want you to port Fraps to Linux. I'm trying to think, I don't know, Office? There's absolutely nothing wrong with LibreOffice. This is just an example for the sake of examples. But let's say you want to switch to Linux, but you can't leave your Microsoft Office behind. Right, Microsoft? Okay, that's not going to work, because Microsoft has their own operating system. I don't know, Autodesk? You can't get AutoCAD for Linux. You can get alternatives, Linux CAD, but you cannot get AutoCAD, Inventor, Revit. You can't get that stuff for Linux. So if you use AutoCAD, but you want to switch to Linux, write Autodesk, call Autodesk, tell them, I want this available for Linux. And like I said, it might take a while and it might take a whole lot of people, but if companies can start, if you can get companies to start seeing the profit opportunity. That's what it's all about, is the profit opportunity. They're not going to support Linux because they think it's a great operating system. They're going to support Linux if they see that enough people are going to be using it for them to make money. Show them that if they switch to Linux, you're going to pay for it. I mean, in some cases, I would rather pay more for the same program available on Linux than on Windows. I would pay, when Fraps was $30, I'd pay $60 for Fraps on Linux. So, you know, just can't think of a whole lot of other examples right now of proprietary software, but if you use a proprietary program that is not made by Microsoft or Apple, and you want to switch to Linux, and that program or those programs are the only things holding you back, first of all, recognize the problem. The problem is not Linux having a lack of support. The problem is the company having a lack of support. Secondly, take action. Tell the company that you want that support. And yeah, that's basically the public service announcement for the day. So yeah, I didn't really plan an outro for this. I'm Jacob Kaufman, I'm there on the street, and I will see you later. See ya.